Okay. So should I introduce myself, that you're being so shy?
I know my limits.
I'm Bill Josephson. I'm a 1952, I think it is, graduate of the University of Chicago. And some of you, an astonishing number, heard me talk about this. It's now 9 years ago. 9 years ago. So here we are in the wreckage of yet another controversial presidential election. And people want to talk about the Electoral College. My view, for whatever it's worth, is that that's a waste of time because it's not going to change. It's a given. So what I would like to talk about, in fact, is how we inform ourselves as good citizens and how difficult that can be, and what we might do, possibly, to make the situation better, and what we clearly cannot do to make the situation better, and where the responsibility for all of this ultimately lies, which is with us. So, I start in a very personal way because I get up every morning about 6 and I go downstairs and I go to the top of the stoop and I pick up the Times and I actually read the Times from cover to cover. I consider this something not only that I inherited from my father, but a duty of citizenship. This is the paper of record. You know, presumably the people who put it together think that at the end of every day, you're a more responsible citizen having gone through the Times than having not, and I really don't like all you young people who just dip through it by some electronic means, because I really do believe that the editors are trying to tell us what they think we should be knowledgeable about on a daily basis. Now, that doesn't follow, as you may know if you looked at my talk from the email post, it doesn't follow that the Times is in any sense infallible. Some of you may remember the great University of Chicago philosophy professor Joe Schwab. Joe said that it was essential for all of us to apply a strong dose of cynical acid to anything that is given to us as true, and I believe that. And I would like to give you some experience, from my own experience, of my frustrations with the Times, which are considerable. When the Times began covering police murders, we will get to the Electoral College, believe me. When the Times began covering police murders, I wrote a letter to it, several letters to it actually, about a case called Tennessee against Garner that I argued in the Supreme Court in 1958. It's a very important case because it held that it was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, the search and seizure clause, for a police officer to shoot a felony suspect fleeing in the back. And I signed that letter, Counsel of Record for the Police Foundation, joined by 9 national and international associations of police and criminal justice professionals, the chiefs of police associations of 2 states, and 31 law enforcement chief executives. Not published. Twice. The Times actually didn't pick up this in its reporting for 2 years. And then I wrote a letter to Dean Baquette and James Bennett saying, okay, you've now decided to recognize this fact. You're putting a lot of resources into the coverage of officer-citizen accounting. Why don't you do a survey of all of the police departments in the United States to determine which has adopted the Garner rule in their guidance and which haven't? Silence. I'll skip over the Times coverage of Citizens United, which is uniformly terrible. I've cited you to the letter that Ira Glasser, the retired head of the ACLU, and I wrote to the Times, which it finally did publish on that terrible, terrible coverage. So this seemingly irrelevant introduction has to do with the Electoral College. How to elect the president was the second most debated issue in the Constitutional Convention. The first was what the composition of the Congress should be. The question of how to elect the president was not decided by the convention until the very last moment. It was assigned to a committee. The committee reported. The report was rejected. It was assigned to another committee. The committee reported. The report was rejected. Finally, they decided on the Electoral College, an imperfect compromise, because as you may know, the drafting resulted in the Jefferson-Burr-Adams election of 1800, which was thrown into the House. And the remedy for the bad drafting is in the 12th Amendment. And so the real history of the Electoral College starts in 1804 with the adoption of the 12th Amendment. Now, that having been said, it's crystal clear that the framers thought that the electors, though they meet separately in each state, would actually exercise discretion to vote for whomever they thought was the best qualified person. The framers did not foresee the rise of parties and the rise of party discipline, which has transformed the college into what it usually is, but not always is, some sort of rubber stamp. And the truth, of course, is that in the overwhelming number of cases, the college has produced a result which is consistent with the majority or plurality result of the electorate, overwhelmingly. So we come to current dissatisfactions with the college. And that's manifested itself in something called national popular vote, which the Times at first opposed and then changed its mind, and in recent years has consistently supported, notwithstanding many letters from me about why it is such an unworkable idea. And here we go, 15 reasons why. And if this gets a bit too much for you, you'll make me stop, you'll raise your hand, you'll ask questions. It's a free-for-all. Okay, as I said, the framers thought that the electors will exercise their discretion. And that still appears to be the law. About half the states and the District of Columbia purport in one way or another to bind their electors to vote for the winner, in some sense, of the popular vote of that state. But in fact, those rules have never been effectively enforced by the courts. And the truth also is that when electors have departed from those rules, as they did, for example, in the election we have just had, we had 7 faithless, so-called faithless electors, a record, more since the election, actually, of John Adams. The Congress has always counted the votes of the so-called faithless electors. National popular vote purports to be a compact that the states can sign in which they agree that their electors will cast their votes not in accordance with that each state's popular vote, but in accordance with the national popular vote winner. And obviously, if the states can't bind their electors to vote in accordance with their state's vote, there's really a very, very serious question as to whether the states can bind their electors to vote in accordance with the national popular vote. And the National Popular Vote Compact, it's a compact among the states, provides no enforcement mechanism. So if there is an elector or a state that does not vote in accordance with the compact, what is to be done? There's no answer to that question. You know, I mentioned earlier that the total number of electors who were faithless in 2016 was a record, and that Congress has always counted the electors' faithless votes. That is true in 2016. The 7 electors who, mainly Clinton electors, hard to understand why the Clinton electors would not vote for Clinton, 5 Clinton electors and 2 Trump electors voted for other people. Hard to understand. Another enforcement issue, which seems to me to be quite important and which national popular vote ignores, is do states that have joined it have a right to require states that break the compact to enforce it? That's a little bit different from the question of enforcing the compact with respect to individual electors in a state. Can a state party to national popular vote who feels that the compact has been broken by another state force that state to adhere to it? No one knows. National popular vote says, this is number 5 of the 15, says that any state may withdraw from the national popular vote compact, but only if it does so well before the presidential election. That is almost certainly unconstitutional. Some of you who are old enough to remember the 2000 election may remember that even after the Florida electors voted, the Florida legislature reserved the right to recast those votes. And there is a dictum in Bush against Gore, that hateful decision. There's a dictum that says that that's legal. The legislature reserves the power to recast up until the date that constitutionally Congress counts the elector votes. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. In a close election, the popular vote in many states may be disputed, as it was in 2000. Many people think that under national popular vote, those disputes will become more and more common. And so national popular vote will inject more chaos into the counting system. National popular vote, we're up to 7. National popular vote purports to give the District of Columbia the right to join it. The 23rd Amendment is perfectly clear that Congress and the states, in deciding to give the district 3 electoral votes, did not intend it to become a state for any other purpose at all. Legislative history on this is absolutely crystal clear. So, does the fact that the district has joined national popular vote make its votes count for purposes of the elector majority that national popular vote is supposed to trigger? Do we need another issue to litigate? Any plurality is the national popular vote winning standard, any plurality. And actually, plurality winners in United States presidential elections are quite common. I'll stick a footnote on that subject into the final text of this. But I want to point out to you that the two lowest pluralities were Lincoln in 1860 and Clinton in 1992. And both won comfortable Electoral College majorities. So, what should be the standard for states that join the popular vote? Do we want to have a plurality as low as 39%, which was Lincoln's? Doesn't tell us. National popular vote has a safety clause. National popular vote says that in the case where there may be a question about how a state party to its compact has cast its vote, the winning, whatever that means, presidential candidate personally can recast the votes of that state. There's a very, is that a hand way back there? No, apparently not. There is a very important 19th century Supreme Court case, McPherson against Blacker, which confirms what the Constitution says, that the states in their legislatures respectively have plenary power to provide how the electors will cast their votes. And only the state legislatures, nobody else. And certainly not the winning popular vote candidate, whatever that is. There are issues about whether or not national popular vote raises issues under the 14th Amendment. That's very technical. I'm going to skip that and get to 11. So we're almost at the end of 15. Only 9 states have adopted national popular vote. California, 55. The District, 3, which we've talked about. Hawaii, 4. Illinois, 20. Maryland, 11. Massachusetts, 14. New Jersey, 15. New York, 29. Vermont, 3. Washington, 12. A total of 166, including D.C., well short of a national popular vote majority of 268 if you don't include district, and 270 if you do. Notice, please, all of these states are blue states, every single one of them. Intuitively, just because I think the Electoral College and the bonus that it gives to small states is a given, so intuitively I think that red states are extremely unlikely to join national popular vote. Extremely unlikely. And indeed, every red state where it has come to a vote has rejected it. Every single one. as well as some blue states. Note 12, note that the 11 largest electoral states, California, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas, have now together 271 electoral votes, a majority. Now, it's very unlikely that these states, in the present political configuration of our country, will vote together. But it's conceivable someday. And does anybody really think that the small states are going to yield their power to elect a president to those large states any more than they would vote for a constitutional amendment to change the Electoral College in favor of popular vote? I don't see anybody leaping to their feet. Consider, please, which national popular vote does not consider the impact of future census on national popular vote. The composition of an electoral majority changes with virtually every census. And the process of apportionment of the representatives among the states, as you may know, is extremely full of hazard. For national popular vote to ignore that is really irresponsible. 14, under the Constitution, interstate compacts, like national popular vote, have to be approved by Congress before they can come into effect. Not only has national popular vote not been approved by Congress, it has not even been proposed to be approved by Congress. There is a Supreme Court case, United States Steel against Multi-State Tax Commission, where the court held that certain multi-state compacts did not require congressional approval if they did not encroach upon either state sovereignty or federal sovereignty. I put it to you that national popular vote clearly encroaches on state sovereignty, the sovereignty of the states that don't adhere. And it may also encroach on federal sovereignty. That's a complicated issue. I actually haven't thought that one through. So, 15, why add in national popular vote yet another layer of uncertainty to what already is an exceedingly uncertain situation? And yet, why all these reasons have been repeatedly called to the attention of the Times and other opinion makers, Times adheres to its support for national popular vote. Not readily understandable by me. Maybe some of you have some ideas. I have never, ever seen any refutation of any of these points. I want to move on to the only other substantive topic that I'm going to deal with at any length in this talk. Larry Lessig, an exceedingly distinguished Harvard law professor, ex-Chicago, ex-Stanford, has raised again an equal protection argument, not a new argument, against what is called unit rule voting in the Electoral College. The unit rule means that the electors bind themselves to be unanimous in their casting of their votes without regard to what the individual electors may think, as long as there is a majority. That's what the unit rule is. And the unit rule emerged over a long historical process, starting at the beginning of the 19th century and winding up in the 1830s and 40s, because the small states realized that voting by the unit rule enhanced their power. So all states in the United States except Maine and Nebraska now cast their elector votes by the unit rule, that is to say, unanimously. Lessig's position that the unit rule raises 14th Amendment issues, as I said before, is not new. And one of the delightful aspects of this debate is that one of his auditors, a 3L Harvard auditor named Brendan Klein, has circulated an article called Problems with the Equal Protection Argument Against Winner-Take-All in the Electoral College. And I'm sure to Professor Lessig's embarrassment, he has cited a United States Supreme Court case from 1990, not exactly unknown, which squarely holds that Virginia's use of the unit rule to cast its elector votes is constitutional. There is another problem with doing away with the unit rule. I'm aware of two studies. One was done using Associated Press results in 2000 by Ballot Access News, which concluded that if the elector votes had been allocated in accordance with the proportional vote in each state, Governor Bush would have received 259, Vice President Gore 257, Ralph Nader 7, and missing or unallocated 15. That's not a majority. That would have thrown the 2000 election into the House. That's an awful prospect. I'm not going to say as much about that as I have said in the past, because that would take us too long. But believe me, everything we can do to make sure that doesn't happen, we should try to do. The second study is credited by Lessig himself to a fellow named Jerry Sims in Georgia. Under Sims' 2016 allocation, Trump would have gotten 267, Clinton 240, a bare majority, assuming the electoral votes of each state were allocated proportionally by the formulas that Sims uses. Very close. Imagine the recounts. Just think about the recounts. Also think about the fact that in Arkansas, Idaho, Montana, the Dakotas, West Virginia, and Wyoming, the difference between a majority and a minority electoral vote was one vote. A Perot or Nader or other serious third-party candidate would have thrown the 2016 election into the House. And in fact, you know, Ross Perot almost pulled that off in 1962. 1992, I'm sorry. And Nader almost pulled that off in 2000. I said I was not going to spend a lot of time on House election for the president, and I'm not. There's a lot of material in the posting. It's very difficult. You can wade through it if you wish. But I want to point out that in a House election of the president, The House does not vote by representatives. It votes by state delegations. Each state delegation has one vote. The House has never adopted rules to govern what is a quorum in a state, what is a majority in a state, what does one do with the votes of states that are equally tied. In Senate election of the Vice President, House election of the President, I calculated what would have happened if the 2000 election had been thrown into the House. The result is chaos. Gerrymander, which I'm also going to touch on very briefly, makes the House of the election of the President even more problematic. The framers thought that this was a safety valve because the House was the representative body. But of course, we now know that the House has virtually ceased to be a representative body. There are a couple of political scientists cited in the notes who argue that gerrymander only cost the Democrats 8 seats in the House in 2016. What they don't seem to understand, and what Nate Cohn doesn't seem to understand, is that with the House divided with only 198 Democrats and probably only 33 seats at stake, 8 seats is it. That's the ball game. All right. You've been very patient. I'm going on to the last section, which is us. The problem, honestly, I believe, is not with the Electoral College. The problem is with you and me and our colleagues in this country. In 2014, the census estimated that the potential voter registered population was about 142 million. Voter registered population, about 142 million. In 2016, Politico, it's hard to believe, estimated that the actual registered voters were 200 million. I find it very difficult to credit that study. But nevertheless, Politico published it, conceivable, not inconceivable. President Obama received more than 69 million votes in 2008 and 66 million in 2012. Secretary Clinton received almost 66 million in 2016. So presumably more than 3 million who voted for President Obama in 2008 did not vote for the Democratic Party candidate in 2016. 3 million. Governor Romney got almost 61 million votes in 2012. So President Trump did only 2 million better at nearly 63 million in 2016. 7 or 8 million voted for Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, other independent candidates. So we're talking about a swing electorate, which is something like 12 million votes. Where those votes are should be a very important question for the next presidential candidate. There are other really startling artifacts of the 2016 election. Do you know that 53% of white women voted for Trump? 53% of white women voted for Trump. "94% of black women voted for Secretary Clinton. 94%. What does all this say about the approximately 40 million registered voters who did not vote in 2016? 40 million. Or the approximately 50 million who could have registered but did not? The Federal Election Commission estimates the total voting age population at almost 250 million. The fact that obstacles to registration and voting are now increasing at an alarming rate, contrary to the historic trend since the Civil War, is another very serious problem. The Nation quotes a study just out by an organization that I am not familiar with and whose work I haven't evaluated, that, for example, says that 200,000 Wisconsin voters were denied the opportunity to vote. 200,000. In a state that President Trump carried by less than 23,000 votes. Also a state, I hasten to add, where despite her husband's advice, Secretary Clinton never campaigned in Wisconsin once after the election. Never. Not once. What about compulsory voting? Other countries have it. What about has been proposed in Congress in connection with requiring women to register for selective service, as us men are still required to do, that made voting registration for federal elections automatic? Sort of like those states where if you apply for a driver's license, you have the opportunity at the same moment to register for vote. It passed the House, believe it or not. The Senate wouldn't go along with it, not surprising, given the predominance of small states in the Senate. But there is a commission created by Congress to study that, just as the president, if you read the editorial in the Times yesterday or today, has created his own commission on obstacles to voting, which is headed by the preeminently obstacle voter Secretary of State of Kansas. Drop-off is another voting complication. People vote for president, and then they don't vote for senator, and then they don't vote for representative, and on down the line. It used to be that you could press one lever on a ballot and it would cast your vote for everybody in your party. Should we go back to that? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? In 2018, 35 senators will be up for re-election. Only 10, I think, are Republicans, and only one, Nevada, is from a state that Secretary Clinton carried. 10 Democrats are up for re-election in 2018 in states that Trump carried. 10. Barbara's and my son has gone back to Nebraska, where Barbara is from, runs the League of Conservation Voters, has successfully run in 2016 5 insurgents against incumbent power board members. Now, you may think that's not a climate issue, but it is, because the power boards in Nebraska are elected and they represent the utilities and the coal industry. If Elliott succeeds in getting 3 more elected in 2018, Greens will control the Nebraska power boards. So I want to challenge you. How many of you are willing to leave a state where your votes really don't count? When our first grandchild is born, I don't know what Barbara's doing, but I'm moving back to Nebraska because I'm confident that my son Elliott is going to turn that state into a blue state sometime during his life. Thank you very much. You're very quiet. Why are you so quiet? Okay, there's a question back there.
So I started out by thanking you for the 15 points and saying I wanted to go back over 55 years to when I was studying American government with the likes of the late Ted Lowy, Clinton Rossiter, and so forth, and you can guess at what institution that was.
Yeah, I've already guessed.
And at the time, it was kind of generally acknowledged by American political scientists that, as you said, even though the Electoral College is tilted toward the smaller states, in practice then, and up to that time through most of our history, it had worked to the advantage of large concentrations of population in the urban centers, in the larger states, and that because of the diversity of those constituencies, this was a good thing. But I suspect that that is no longer the case.
Migration has changed.
Why did that change?
Because, first of all, the small states lost population.
Small states did.
Small states lost population. And therefore, their electoral votes don't change. But the large states gain population. And most of those votes are, in the current political science jargon, quote, wasted, close quote. And that trend continues.
How about the fact that in those days, big states like California, Illinois, and New York were contestable?
Remember that in those days, the number of Electoral College votes that California and New York had were half the size that they are now.
Well, I remember when New York had 45.
Right, and now it has 29.
Thank you for coming, sir. You've talked a lot about the problems with the national vote movement and the problems with the Electoral College system and other aspects of our electoral mechanisms. Is there anything that you'd like to see changed that is would be both effective and actually something that could be implemented? Could you talk about that?
You know, I have resisted all of these years since I was retained by the Democratic National Committee in 1980 to deal with the possible effects of John Anderson's intervention. I have retained from writing the book on these issues that needs to be written for several reasons. You know, most books about our American electoral system are for or against the college, and they're polemical. And as you understand from my talk, I'm not for it or against it. I take it as a given. There's nothing we can do about it. Are there things that legislation could do to ameliorate it? Yes, there are. And actually, in 2008, I began to draft what I call the Presidential Election Act, and I got diverted. I've now decided I have to go back and write that book and make the act an integral part of that book. So the answer to your question is yes, if I live long enough.
And some highlights of that book might be?
Oh, we have to deal with succession issues. We have to deal with the way House votes if an election is ever called into the House. We can deal with the House voting situation by legislation. There are precedents for legislating House rules. We can deal with, you know, it's incredible. Chuck Schumer, who's not a bad person, he holds hearing after hearing on the Electoral College several years ago, kills millions of trees, but he doesn't pick up the most simple thing that I think any majority in the Senate would agree to. Make the filibuster rule not applicable to the Senate's election of a vice president who doesn't get an Electoral College majority. Simple, easy, necessary. Don't ask me.
Thank you, sir.
What about 1968? How close were we to sending that to the House?
Lost by a plurality. Richard Nixon actually only had a plurality victory in 68.
What would it have taken, what state could have swung to
Well, I'd have to go back.
throw it to the House?
But you know, it was the third closest election in our history.
You would need two close states. California would have been enough. California wasn't close. But Nixon got 303 electoral votes when you needed 270 for a majority. So he had a margin of 33.
Mark has an advantage. He has his computer.
Mike. I'm not looking at it.
You mentioned one of the issues that you'd address in a future book was issues of succession. The Secession Act of 1947, the way that it's popularly interpreted would be if the president, vice president are both impeached, it would go to the Speaker of the House, and he would be sworn in as president. Do you have a view on that? I know that the definition of officer is often debated in academic circles. Just curious what your view is.
Well, it's interesting you raise this issue. Obviously, I know what you're thinking about, and so does everybody else here. They know what you're thinking about. The academic literature on that question is divided, as you probably know. And you probably also know that there's nothing in the Constitution that says the Speaker has to be a representative. The Speaker can be anybody. Does that change the result?
I think that means that they wouldn't be the officer.
Representative, would the Succession Act still provide for the Speaker to succeed?
Would they meet the definition of officer under the Act of 1947?
Well, actually, you've touched on a subject that I would like to address in the statute that I hope to live long enough to draft.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Hi. I'm wondering why you don't draw any connection between America's low voter turnout and the fact that I, for example, am a Democrat in New York, so you have now twice told me my vote doesn't count. So if we have set up a system where we are telling millions and millions of voters that they are inconsequential, we can't then really be surprised that they don't turn out.
What can we do about demographic change?
What can we do about making one vote count?
What can we do about demographic change?
But are you really saying it's easier for me to move than for us to address a system that's fair?
I think it's easier for you to move than to address a system that's unfair.
I thought the Constitution was supposed to be a living, breathing document.
It is. It does live and it does breathe, but not necessarily the way you want it to.
So instead of having a fair republic, I should just move to
Look, I'm ready
Kansas?
to move to Nebraska. Are you ready to move to Montana? It's West Virginia.
I guess I'm just wondering
Where are you
why
from?
I'm from New York.
Ah, That's the problem.
It sounds like voter turnout is the problem and that my vote doesn't count is the problem.
Voter turnout is a problem. I need to pay attention, which I haven't had time to do, to those 12 million votes and where they are.
Aren't they in Pennsylvania and a
I
lot of
don't
states where they're taking away voters of color?
Look, John Podesta is a good friend of mine and a good guy, but he screwed this election up.
He had a lot of help.
He used to have a lot of power. He's now like me and nobody. It's the best I can do for you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation and 20 points. I grew up under Richard Daley and machine politics, and when their conventions
Daley and I were very good friends.
and conventions were kind of like a mini electoral college where every state came in with their favorite son, Stevenson, et cetera. I'm kind of longing to go back to that as much as I hated, I'm sorry, good friend of yours, but I'm wondering, I really feel that,
Strong argument for boss rule.
okay,
All right?
thank you, yeah.
There really is a strong argument for boss rule, right? Clear it with Sydney, if you remember.
Pardon?
You don't remember Clear It with Sydney?
No.
Oh, it was a famous
don't.
Roosevelt remark, that Sidney Hillman, ran the strongest union in New York in those days. And Roosevelt said, if you want to do that, clear it with Sydney.
Thank you.
Are we done? I guess oh boy, we're not done.
Howdy. I was going to say, so I'm from Michigan, which is a state that actually counts, at least in this past election.
She also didn't campaign in after the convention, even though her husband told her to.
Yeah, I mean, I think she did a garbage job campaigning.
Yeah, Georgia and Arizona. Where did you get any idea in her head that she could carry Georgia or Arizona?
Yeah, so anyway, my feeling, though, is that your problem isn't so much with the popular vote as it is with the means to accomplishing it that the states are employing, the compact. But to me, it seems that, like, some of your points, like, for instance, I think it was your 12th point was concerning margins, but it seems to me that the national margin, at least in every single election since, like, 1820, has been greater than the margin, like the raw margin in, like, just my state of Michigan. So it seems to me like that's not a problem. And then in terms of several of your points were essentially the political feasibility, but to me it seems like if the goal is a popular vote, then it's much more politically feasible to have the compact and maybe have Congress, which you'd only need, I guess, a majority to accomplish to make the compact all right legally. To me, it seems like it's more politically feasible to do it via the compact than a constitutional amendment.
I hate to admit this, right? But when I gave this lecture in 2008, Bob Bennett, the dean at Northwestern, was here, and he's the author of the best book on the National Popular Vote Compact. And Bob and I admitted to this audience, if anybody remembers, that we thought that if we were really pressed, we could draft a national popular vote that might work. So you may be right. I haven't done it. Bob doesn't seem to be interested in it. Should I consider that? I'll consider it. Will I actually do it in the book? I doubt it.
All right. Thank you.
There was somebody else here. Oh, more. God.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm from Pennsylvania, and my husband's from Wisconsin, so together we have totally failed America.
Are you a voting resident of Pennsylvania?
No, we're both voting residents of New York.
You realize that poor old Bob Casey is up for re-election in a state in 2018 that Trump carried?
Didn't know that.
Are you moving back?
I'm looking at my husband on that one. My question, though, is...
No, I'm serious.
I'm
Bob
serious,
Casey
too.
is a good guy.
I know.
He's vulnerable.
Do you want to pay our salaries to move back to Pennsylvania? And then
You
we
don't think you can get a good job in Pennsylvania? You look very marketable to me.
We're trying. We're going to see. But my question is about, you talked about voting, obviously, in the national election, but what about for the presidential primaries? Do you see the same low voter turnout? And what are your thoughts about how to make that better so we can get better candidates to
I
start
haven't really
with?
thought about it. It's a good question. Primary turnout is roughly half on the average of general election turnout. So the primaries really, the lady who was interested in bosses, well, the bosses are still there.
Thank you.
There was one other.
Hi. How are you?
Hey, sure.
Yeah.
Now, try not to make a speech.
No, I won't.
Try just to ask a question.
Okay.
Try to be succinct.
I've known him for like 40 years, so it's okay. What are your thoughts on the fact that about 1% of the population is now involved in the military and half the population doesn't pay taxes? What's the effect, in your mind, of that on voter turnout, if any?
If you go back to Jack Raymond's article on national service in the 1965 New York Times Magazine, you will see that I was strongly in favor of compulsory national service and still am. Basic for everybody, including women. And then you have a choice. You can stay in the military, you can join the Peace Corps, you can do other kinds of community service. But the disconnect between us and military service is a tragedy. The fact that we have a voluntary army that is populated by mainly underprivileged people is a disgrace. And to restore that connection is so important. I don't know whether you remember Mark Morris's, what's the, Barbara help me, the guy who wrote the film, who went up to the congressman in the course of the film and asked him,
Oh, Michael Moore.
Right.
Michael Moore?
There's that telling moment, his exchange with the congressman on military service, where it's quite clear that the congressman doesn't even understand the issue. But your issue you're raising is exceedingly important, exceedingly important. Thank you very much.
Before we go, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Mr. Josephson on... I would just like to take the opportunity to thank you on behalf of the Alumni Club of New York and present you with a gift. It's a picture frame that will be...
Welcome, unnecessary welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
He's only 6'4".
for those of you who don't know, my name is Charlie Vidal. I am the communications co-chair of the Alumni Club. Part of my duties include running the Facebook page, where there are many current students who are interning and young alums moving to New York in search of apartments. So if you are going to take his advice and leave the state of New York, if you could connect with some of our incoming Maroons and we can get a little bit of an apartment exchange, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you once again, and thank all of you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Before you turn around, Bill, I'd like to take a picture. We'd like to take a picture.